welcome back from the break for those of you who are here, and welcome to those who join us online. I now have the great pleasure of presenting the host for this session's roundtable discussion on how to quota. And the host for this session is Catarina Barbieri from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas Law School in Sao Paulo, Brazil, but also a guest researcher at LawTransform currently. And without much further ado, I'm just going to give you the word. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Siri, for the introduction. Thank you for the LawTransform team for assembling this wonderful panel. Hello, everyone. Well, first, I would like to welcome our panelists today and our audience both here in Bergen and also online for the second roundtable of the 2021 Bergen Exchanges. So, as Siri mentioned, my name is Catarina Barbieri. I am a lecturer in law and a researcher at the Gender and Law Center at FGV Law School in Brazil, and a visiting researcher here at LawTransform. I would like to start by introducing our incredible group of panelists today. I would like to first welcome here back to the stage, actually, Professor Ruth Rubio Marin, Professor of Law at the University of Sevilla, which you all had the opportunity to hear in the opening keynote just a few minutes ago, and Professor Ragnhild Murios, Professor of Political Science here at the University of Bergen. Joining us online, I would also like to welcome Professor Francisca Refsum Jensenius, Professor of Political Science at the University of Oslo. Hi, Francisca, and Professor Paula Bergallo, Professor of Law at the University Torquato di Tella in Argentina. So we have here a great mix of legal scholars and political scientists together discussing the question of how to quote them. As you know, quotas have been used to promote political and other forms of representation of women and minorities in spaces of power for more than a century now. However, quotas remain a source of political, constitutional, and scholarly contestation. So what we're going to try to do in this panel is drawing from data from India, from Latin American countries, from African countries. In the first part of this roundtable, we'll discuss the types of quota that there are, including new scholarship on financing schemes to promote gender equality in politics. What is the evidence on the effects of quotas, and what lessons can be drawn? Also, Professor Rubio Marin will address the issue, a very important open issue around the constitutional contestation over quotas. And well, I will have some help online with questions. So we'll have a second moderator which will help me with the online questions. And the idea is to have a kind of more of a free form conversation. So I will briefly start, get the ball rolling, talking briefly about how Brazil went about answering this question on how to quota, and then pass on the word to my fellow panelists. So regarding the Brazilian case, what is the context of the Brazilian gender quotas? Brazil is an interesting case because it is an outlier in the region. Even though women are 51% of Brazilian population and 52% of the electorate, we have only 15% of seats occupied by women in Congress. Black women occupy only 2.5% of seats, even though they're more than a quarter of the population. Brazil, one would think, well, probably has a recent quota law, but that's not the case. Brazil has had a legislated gender quota law for 24 years now. And it still ranks very poorly. If you look at the ranking of women in national parliaments organized by the Interparliamentary Union, Brazil ranks at position 140 out of 183 positions at the moment. So it ranks very low. It is the worst position in Latin America, together with Paraguay. And at 15%, Brazil is way below the average of the Americas, which is around 30%, and way below our fellow neighbor, Argentina, that, for example, has now around 42.4% of women. So since 1997, then, we have adopted legal electoral gender quota for the Chamber of Deputies and state and municipal legislatures. It is not embedded in the Constitution. It is then a federal law applicable to all proportional elections, and it's mandatory for all political parties. but it is somewhat easier to get rid of because it's not embedded in the Constitution. Originally, the statute said something, and here I'm kind of freely translating. Each party or coalition shall reserve a minimum of 30% and a maximum of 70% of candidacies of each sex. What happened was that parties alleged that no women were interested in running, and lists would then run with less than, sometimes none, no women. Parties would be like, well, we reserved, but no women knocked on our doors interested in running because women are not interested in politics. Politics is not the natural place of women. Women rather be at home, perhaps, doing other things, house chores perhaps, but not interested in politics. Therefore, they were not interested. Well, what happened was that in 2009, there was a change in the writing of the statute that now reads like each party or coalition must fill a minimum of 30% and a maximum of 70%. So if a party is allowed, let's say, 100 candidates, it must run with 30 women. But one important issue is that when we approved the quota, they also approved that the list could be longer. So in a way, diluting the effect of the quota when we voted this in 1997. Well, given that there was a little bit of improvement in the way we wrote the statute, right? Why, after 12 years of the last change, we still only have 15%? This is not totally surprising. I think in order to understand why Brazil has had a quota law that is so ineffective, we have to understand the interplay between the provisions, the writing of the gender quota statute, the electoral political system, and the actions of other important actors. And here I would like to particularly stress the role of the Electoral Court. Scholars point to three main reasons why the system has such limited results. The first is the peculiarities of the Brazilian electoral system. We have an open list proportional representation system. It's an unranked list. So all candidates individually compete for the preferences of all voters, which creates not only an inter-party competition, but an intra-party competition as well, dispute. The open list system, as you may imagine, leads to extremely personalized electoral campaigns. It does favor incumbents. It favors anyone who is already pre-known by the voter, right? So it favors incumbents, it favors candidates with deep pockets, it favors candidates with other types of political capital, such as being a celebrity or being a religious leader. And women here are usually not those people. The second reason is the absence of a strong and clear sanction for political parties failing to meet the minimum percentage. And here, an important footnote. In 1997, the small women caucus that was trying to pass the gender quota tried to put the sanction in the bill. The original bill had a sanction, but obviously that became a bargaining chip in order to approve the quotas, so the sanction was stricken down. And thirdly, the political party structure and the candidate selection mechanisms put in place also tends to exclude women. Political parties have high levels of autonomy. The idea of political party autonomy is actually embedded in the Constitution. This leads to very little transparency in the way they organize themselves internally, in the way they select candidates, and more recently, due to the fact that funding has become mainly public, also in the way they distribute campaign resources. But as I mentioned, I believe it is also important to analyze the role of the Electoral Court in the last few decades and the relationship that this particular body has been in conversation, so to speak, with Congress. The electoral justice in Brazil is a nonpartisan administrative and judicial body. It has a double function. It organizes elections, but it also has a jurisdictional function. And until 2010, right after the last change in the statute, it had a very timid role in enforcing the gender quotas. But this has been slowly changing in the past decade. After the 2009 reform, it started denying registration of parties and coalition lists that didn't fulfill the minimum 30%. But what we have observed as scholars is that parties and political leadership have been resisting the quotas in many different and creative ways, and always trying to circumvent it. We have seen from then on a significant increase in the number of candidates that the literature sometimes calls bogus candidates or fictitious phantom candidates. From actions for anything from signature fraud. They're obviously very anecdotal things like using Barbie doll photos instead of enlisting real women, to more elaborate ways of attracting women without giving them any means to become a competitive candidate. But then from 2010 onwards, we start seeing the lower electoral courts analyzing cases where either the opposing political party or sometimes the electoral prosecution's office start filing suits against political parties or party lists or candidates, including the women. There are the so-called phantom candidates. Until there is no legal definition of what constitutes a fictitious candidate, and court rulings are somewhat contradictory. In our research, we've been trying to track all these court decisions and trying to make sense of what is going on in the courts, but also how the political system is going to react to that. And the growing importance of the electoral justice in the Brazilian case goes a little bit further. The story doesn't end there, because two of the most significant changes in the electoral rules happened in the last 2 years through courts consulting capacity. And this is something interesting, or I think a little bit different, because some actors can come before the court before the election, before the campaign, and they can say, oh, I have a doubt about how to interpret this certain part of the electoral code. And the court will then say, well, this is how you should interpret it. So in 2018, there was a consultancy, and it was asked, if we have a 30% gender quota, shouldn't the public funds match this 30%? And the court said, in this consultancy capacity, said yes. So we now have a gender finance quota of 30%. There are many issues around this, which I'm not going to go into detail. And in 2020, or for the 2020 municipal elections, happened just last year, they were asked, given the Brazilian Black, the Black community is hugely underrepresented, shouldn't Black candidates have the funds to match, should be matched by funds? And the court said yes to that as well. So if a party runs a list with 42% of Black candidates, being that female or male, the party should match those funds in 42% as well, therefore creating a finance quota for Black candidates. So these quotas are in place, and then, well, one should ask, how did Congress react to that, and how the political parties and political leadership reacted to that, right? And as we speak, Brazil is undergoing a big electoral reform. And to judge by the discussions in Congress that we've been seeing in the past months, and particularly the past week and this week, I believe the reaction is going to be most likely an attempt to limit the scope and the power of electoral courts, a freeze in the status quo of the gender quota, and a complete silence or blank about the financing schemes for Black candidates. So I think in being silent, I think they're speaking a lot about how many quotas the political system is willing to incorporate. And I think I hope this is a segue to some of the things we are going to hear next. And I'll stop here. With that, I would like to invite Professor Paula Bergallo. I think it will be interesting to hear her comments about the Argentine case, which is quite different and more successful, somewhat more successful than the Brazilian case. And do you hear me, Paula?
Yes, Catarina, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you from Argentina. I want to share a small number of slides with some of the history of the Argentine case. I'm going to be brief. because this is part of a research that I'm preparing, because we are celebrating 30 years of the quota law that was passed in 1991 this year. So it's time for assessing these 3 decades in which we have been working on parity, or in the move toward parity. So I'm going to be brief. I'm going to say something about the process of these 3 decades, and I'm going to show you some brief slides with data, but I'm going to be brief. So about the process has been an iterated process. And as you have told us, for Brazil, this is a process that has had several barriers. But in the case of Argentina, we can say that it has been a process in which we moved from quotas as an affirmative action project to parity in terms of like the democratic parity project. This was something that happened in 2017. So 20-something years after the first law, we moved to a 50-50 parity law. And what we have done to enforce the Quito process, or the Quito democratic parity project that the region agreed in 2007. So, but this has also been a resisted process, full of barriers, of recursive judicialization instances, different cycles of judicialization. In the beginning, the questions posed to the courts were about the constitutionality of the law, and then there were enforcements, compliance, regulatory struggles that reached the courts, and they still are reaching the courts. So this has been a fight over 30 years, and it continues to be a fight for the enforcement of the 2 different stages of the law, and also the subnational laws that sprang from this federal process. So if we were to look to the history of these different stages, we could say that in the first 5 years, the fight was to keep the law alive. And this was very important because in 1994, we hosted a constitutional convention. That was the first instance in which a constitutional convention was celebrated with implementation of a quota law. So women were 30% of the participants in the convention, and they managed to pass an article, Article 37 of the Constitution, that enshrined the constitutionality of these projects. So we have a special consideration in the Constitution, as well as the inclusion of CEDAW, that have provided for the end of the first cycle of judicialization of questions to the law. Then we have 10 years in which we had to fight for the regulation. There were 3 instances of regulation and a case taken to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, negotiated with the government of Argentina. So 3 regulations in 1993, the first one, then one in 2000 after the negotiation with the Marciadri de Morini. This is the woman who took the radical party to the courts and then to the Inter-American system, and help us to re-regulate the law in a way that it could be implemented in a fairer way. And so in 2000, we had a new regulation, and a 3rd instance of regulation was in 2005. And then after the Ni Una Menos movement, we have what was actually the 2nd cycle of parity law, because in 2000 we had 3 provinces that passed 50% quota laws, but actually after the 2015 Ni Una Menos movement, we started to see the approval of provincial parity laws, and then in 2017 the federal parity law that started a new round of regulations in the provinces that had passed quota laws that moved towards the parity law. So we see this iterated process in the 20 years since the law began to be really enforced in the early 90s. So, and after these parity laws were approved at the federal and the provincial level, we see a cycle of judicialization about the way to replace candidates and the way the lists are organized, etc. So we see still the recursive cycle of judicialization. Regarding the impact, of course, it's difficult to assess it, and it's a great empirical research project to gather data for this, just some data. This is how life was, because before the 1991 quota law, so we only have 5-6 members in the House of Representatives, and after the law was passed, we moved towards percentages and numbers that reach 39% of women in Congress before the parity law. Then we see the long-term numbers, the change in the Senate and the House over the 30 years period that the laws have been regulating gender equality in politics. And you see that that's the basic number, like the democratic representation or the descriptive representation side of the impact. This is the movement in the provincial laws and how women have improved their participation from almost nothing to 50% of their role in the provincial congresses of the country. So this is another way in which to register the descriptive representation that the law finally brought. And if we were to look at the 30-year process, we also should take into account that starting in 2007, we see a consequence of the law, and one of the main women who was part of the Congress as a result of the quota, which is the case of Cristina Kirchner, that finally reached the presidency of the country. Some years before, also, we had seen 2 women reach the Supreme Court of Argentina, which was an unprecedented process, also part of a decree in which the president committed himself to send diverse members to the court, including gender diversity. So we also see some years later, the first vice president of the country, who is Gabriela Michetti, and the first governor of the province of Buenos Aires, Maria Eugenia Vidal, the province that hosts 40% of the inhabitants of the country. So this is what we have seen, and you could say that in the intersection of this top-down type of reform that brought increased number of women to politics and to power, and the women's movement and the increase of the women movement that we have seen in the last 6 years after the Ni Unas Menos mobilization and the abortion reform mobilization, things have changed. And since the last 2 years, we also have a National Ministry of Women, Gender and Diversity Affairs. So this is part of the history of the last 30 years. Of course, there are many challenges and restrictions that remained, and also many pending effects in terms of substantive representation. The analysis of the impact of the presence of women in the bills and draft bills presented to Congress has shown that women have presented more than 60% of the projects that deal with women's rights and gender issues in a broader term. They have led the reform of same-sex marriage and also gender identity, as well as other important regulations and legislations on gender violence, also and criminal law reforms in terms of sexual violence. Still, there are persistent vertical and horizontal segregation dynamics within Congress and also in Argentine politics in general. Of course, women remained occupying leadership positions only in women affair or traditional family commissions within Congress, and they are moving forward to other non-traditional gender type of leadership. But this has been a slow process in the last 30 years, and it has only begun to change substantively in the last 5 years. We still see difficulties in renewing their positions, a lot of change in their appointment as members of the House and the Senate, barriers, of course, in accessing finances and campaign finance resources, as you mentioned also for Brazil, and an increased leading position in parties, but still marginal compared to the role of men and the proportion that the quota law or the parity laws mandated. Sorry. And we also see lots of challenges when they leave Congress and they face the challenges to continue their professional lives and sustaining their careers. And we are beginning to see an increasing presence of gender violence in politics. This has to be studied and accounted for. It's of course not as the violence we see in other countries of the region where femicides are political femicides, but it's increasingly beginning to be an important trait of Argentine politics. And there are many other challenges, and one puzzle could be to ask whether it has taken so long for us to think about quotas or parity for other institutions, where Argentinians hadn't explored the affirmative politics that we have undertaken 30 years ago in Congress. And that's also one of the very important challenges, because that's where you build careers into power, both in the public, the social, and the private sector. And in those arenas, the presence of women in leadership is still lagging behind other percentages compared to the region and also to the subnational level. So I'll stop here, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula, for this brief but very interesting introduction. I already have a million questions or a million things I would I would ask you, but I will pass immediately to Francisca so that she can also comment on the Indian case before we move on.
Great. Thanks so much for this invitation and for starting this important conversation. So Catarina has asked me to speak about the Indian case of quotas, which I've done work on. And since I don't have a lot of time to start, I wanted to make three main points. One is about the design of the system itself. One is about the effects of quotas for minority groups, and one is on the effects of quotas for women. And so I'm not sure how many of you are very familiar with the Indian case, but India has one of the most interesting quota systems. And I think the longest standing. India has had quotas of some kind since they started getting elections of any kind. Quotas were introduced by the British colonial rulers, and discussions about it started in 1905-06. Discussions about that was about quotas for minorities, originally Muslims, later on the former untouchable community. Quotas for women came on the agenda very soon after that. And so quotas in politics were implemented in the constitution, the first Indian constitution at independence. And in the constitution, they granted quotas for the scheduled castes, which are the former untouchables, which is a large minority characterized primarily by exclusion and marginalization, and also for scheduled tribes, which are tribal groups, were also characterized by exclusion and marginalization. They decided not to grant quotas for Muslims, which had been the original discussion, to a large extent because of the division between India and Pakistan, which made them really worried about granting quotas to a group that considered itself a different community. So they didn't want to grant quotas on the basis of identity and community, but only on the basis of exclusion. Later on, the discussion of quotas for women in politics came on the agenda. And since the early 1990s, women have had quotas in local politics in India. India has elected positions in politics at 5 levels. And so local politics are considered the three levels of local politics is village, block, and district. So women have quotas there, but not in state assemblies or in parliament. Scheduled castes and tribes, the minority groups, have quotas at all 5 levels. In addition, they have quotas in educational institutions and jobs. The quotas is a big thing in Indian politics, and there are lots of discussions about how to expand it to other groups, where do you set the limit, etc., how many quotas we really have. Because at some point, if you have quotas for 70% of the population, you don't really have a liberal democracy anymore. So there have been tons of really interesting discussions about that. I would encourage you all to go and read up on the cool case of Indian quota systems. But I want to move on to reporting on a bit of the effects of these quotas. Because they have been in place a really long time, they're very interesting to study for effects. Because often when we see limited effects of quotas, we say, well, they haven't been in place for so long, we have to wait longer. But in India, they have actually been in place now for at least since 1950. So that's a long time. You should start seeing effects after this time period. And since this is part of a course with many PhD students, I wanted to just bring up the fact that my first PhD project was trying to look at effects of one of these quotas, which was quota for scheduled caste, the untouchables, in state assemblies. And I entered my PhD with a desire to look at the substantive effects of these quotas. Have they really made a difference in terms of policy and development? Have they benefited this community? And I spent a lot of time developing that as a research project, gathered tons of data, ran analysis, and found a 0 effect. Crisis of PhD, right? I also did a lot of interviews, however, which made me reframe my project completely. And I came to believe that looking for substantive effects, or looking for development effects of these quotas didn't actually make as much sense as I had thought originally. And that's for a couple of reasons. So first of all, it's because of institutional design, because as you have both brought up here, these policies can be designed in really different ways. And how they're designed will directly affect the incentive structures that they have and the kind of effects we should expect from them. So in India, the quotas have all been implemented as reserved seats in first past the post electoral districts, which means minorities, for example, who are elected from these quota seats, although they're from a small minority group, are answerable to a full electorate of all groups, and all parties run there, so they tend to be from the main parties, which means they are completely embedded into the normal party structure. They are responsive to voters from all groups, and therefore they will end up behaving really similarly as other politicians. Some have them come and said, oh, the quotas are a huge failure because of that. But I've come to think that that depends on what you want with a quota policy. Is your goal to create group representation in the sense that you want this group to be guaranteed an articulation of their own group interests, or is your idea to break a systematic exclusion from politics? And I think if you look at a lot of political theory, it's really the latter you're after, in which case this kind of design is appropriate. But then what you should expect to see is not more development for that group, but what you should see is a reduction in discrimination against the group. And so my PhD project ended up then being an analysis of different kind of outcomes. I ended up dividing into 6 types of outcomes I looked at, including political effects at the elite level and more broader societal level, and representational effects at the elite level and broader societal level. And there we do see effects, not necessarily the ones we desire to see, but you see quite strong effects. So for example, when you have new people entering politics, you see lower turnout, less skilled campaigning, less financing, etc., because these people are new to politics. But you also see a quick catching up. And when it comes to respect, you see that there is an increase in respect, although not maybe as dramatic as one would have hoped for. There are effects, but the things don't happen overnight, and social norms are hard to change. And there's some really interesting research done by Simon Chauchard, who's another scholar who had studied these quotas, showing that when it comes to inter-caste relations, you see big effects in what people consider socially appropriate. So what's PC to do, but not necessarily in their ingrained thoughts about the other group. But on the other hand, isn't it a big effect to see changes in what's PC? I actually think so. So in the Indian quota system case, it's really a matter of, do you see the glass as half full or half empty? Because you can interpret the effect we see as quite positive or quite negative, depending on your angle. Moving then on from this minority quotas, which has been studied extensively, to the women's quotas. We've had these women's quotas since the early 1990s in these local council. And this has been a favored topic of study for economists because they were randomized or close to randomized, and because you have a huge number of them. So there are tons of studies of village level quotas for women in India. And some people have found effects on things like substantive representation, that women tend to do what women care about more. Then again, other studies don't. There are really, really contradictory findings depending on sample. No one studies the whole country, so people pick different regions. In some cases, you see really positive stories, in other cases, not. Then you have lots of qualitative studies showing that a lot of women who get elected are proxies for someone else. They're picked up because they're someone's wife, etc., or because someone thinks they can control them. And then that's been put out as a reason to say that they haven't been very successful. But then again, if you trace these women over time, you can see that a large section of them end up getting empowered through being in politics. And by the time they've been there for 2 years, they start behaving very savvy, knowing what they're up to, and actually behaving quite similar to male politicians, for better and worse. One of my own recent studies of women and male politicians in West Bengal in India, for example, finds that women tend to in behavioral games, incoming women politicians tend to behave in a less corrupt way or dishonest way than men. But when you look at experienced ones, they're actually more prone to dishonest behavior. That could be because of learning effect in office. It could be because of selection. It could be because of what kind of people get reelected, who chooses to stay in politics for whatever reason. But women end up catching up with men in many of the typical male behaviors. So one sees that women may be very, very different as they enter office because they're less experienced, but with time in office, they tend to become really similar to men. Is that a sad thing? That's again, depends on your perspective. I am of the opinion that it's okay that women end up proving to be human beings who respond to incentive structures and behave similarly to the other category or categories. But some people find it sad that women don't come with inherently more positive attributes than men. At the same time, I'll end with the idea that if you end up having a political system where decent people who enter into the system become corrupt and terrible, and you should look at the system and change that, and maybe not say that it was had no value to bring women into politics. So I'll end there for now, and I have a lot more to say if there are questions.
Great, thank you, Francesca. I think in Brazil, at least, one of the discussions is about the fact that some of the women that came into politics more recently and have a large chunk of these 15% I mentioned are conservative women. So that kind of discussion about which women we want or which women will lead to the aspirations that we have about what women are, who are they, and what they should behave in politics is very much, one of the things we're discussing in Brazil at the moment, and to different, with very different opinions of how we should go about that. So thank you for that input, because I think it taps into something that we are also quite aware in Brazil. Mm-hmm. I would like to welcome Professor Ragnhild Murios to give her contribution, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so quotas are designed all over the world to address the overrepresentation of men in politics. And it's important to just think that a couple of decades ago, when this quota politics was really starting to emerge around the world, that 90% of all the legislators in the world were men. But not only is politics overrepresented by men, it is overrepresented by rich men. In many countries in the world, the chances of a poor man or a woman to get elected into the national parliament is actually nil. It does not happen. Just as there is a glass ceiling for women, there is also what is called the class ceiling, or a cash ceiling by someone. And in a book published by Nicola Carnes just a few years ago, he found that only 1% of all the legislators in the US was actually working class, had a working class background. And very few of those who had a working class background got re-elected. And of course, among those who were working class, very few were women. And one of the questions that has been emerging now, that was actually asked in some of the works on democracy some decades ago, was what is actually the value of political rights to stand for elected office if it's only accessible to the wealthy? So increasingly, scholars engage in the question of gender and political representation have taken an intersectional approach to the question of gender quotas, advancing the idea that one of the reasons why women are underrepresented in politics has to do with lower access to electoral funding, and also their opportunity to grow their own wealth, and also their access to networks who are wealthy. And in other words, the class and the glass ceiling go together, because in the world today, money matters. So how do we think about this then? I'm thinking that instead of forwarding the idea that there should be quotas for the poor, there are actually several initiatives across the world that see gender balance in relation to electoral funding. And they are introducing schemes and policies that redirect electoral funding in a way that make party leaders less likely to think of that there is a financial drawback in actually nominating women. So, and even sometimes it's a gain to nominate women, a financial gain for nominating women. Some of these initiatives are top-down. It's using public funding as a sanction mechanism. So in countries like France, Ireland, and also in other parts of the world, parties get a financial penalty if they do not meet a given gender quota threshold or a parity goal. So actually it's quite interesting in France that gender balance has increased as the fines are going up. So moving slowly towards gender parity. And in Ireland, another country that has introduced sanctions, Fiona Buckley and Mark Mariani just found out that after the sanction penalty was introduced in Ireland, parties were much more likely to back women candidates financially. Because before the funding mechanism, parties on average gave men more campaign funds than to women. But after the sanction, parties started to fund women because they were afraid that women, if they did not get elected in high enough numbers, party would have to pay a fine. And we've seen also similar top-down initiatives using public funding in other countries like in Chile, Croatia, Italy, but where they have a more kind of positive spin on the sanction mechanism. The parties actually get a reward for increasing gender balance. So these schemes are, as we discussed earlier, they are coming from local initiatives, and they have really also have different ways of how this is designed. But there is also someone that these sanctions, not always, but quite often is coming together with a quota as a sanction for non-compliance. But we can also see that there are some bottom-up initiatives addressing issues related to the class and the glass ceiling in politics. And this is often in countries where there is no quota. So in countries like, for instance, Malawi and Ghana, there are schemes targeting women directly with extra electoral funding, or that pay some of the expenditures like registration fees involved in getting elected. So showing that gender quota is not the only way, but there are also other ways of actually getting towards gender balance or a balance in politics, trying to address some of what is actually causing political inequalities, focusing also on, of course, economic inequalities in the society. But there are a lot of problems connected to having a too delicate web of quota requirements. And Jana Belchner studied the very elaborate gender design in Tunisia and found that it was so difficult to comply with all the requirements that only the largest party in the country were able to actually do so, because there were all these kinds of different mechanisms and different kind of requirements the party had to do. So the smaller parties had a disadvantage. This is also an issue of democratization, of course, that it can be, as we also studied earlier in Uganda, the quota design can be a way of hegemonic leaders to actually to sustain their power. So we just done a study. I did just a study with Amy Mazer and Susan Hort on penalties and rewards in politics across the world on something called gender electoral financing, where we're looking at both top-down and bottom-up initiatives. And we did find that in quite a lot of the, in most, or in at least the majority of cases, we could see that there was a significant change in gender balance after such schemes were introduced. But it's not everywhere. So we can't really assume that wherever you have a quota and you have a quota design, that it's actually going to make a difference. But what we actually found that was really interesting also is that there are different pathways to increase gender equality in different gender balance in politics, and that there are it's also possible to actually make some changes and having positive outcomes without gender quotas. But I think that what is interesting in political science these last years has been this growing awareness that there is a relationship between different kinds of inequalities, and that you can use also gender quotas to address these, and with the design to not just target blankly the numbers, but also trying to go into the mechanisms of what is actually causing gender inequality in politics in the first place. So thank you.
Thank you. I would like to then pass to Ruth. So
Yes. So you were asking me, Catarina, basically to just say a few words about constitutional contestation. And in essence, I would say that constitutional contestation has not subsided and is unlikely to do so. And the reason is, and I link this to what I was saying before about the DNA of constitutionalism, is that in a way, gender quotas are in tension with two key principles, or two or three key principles in that constitutionalism, both in terms of rights and democracy structures. So in terms of rights, they can be seen as in tension with formal equality readings that simply would have the law be neutral in terms of gender. In connection with that principle of formal equality, you can also link the right to access, the right to equal access to political office, of course, but also political parties' autonomy. And you were saying that this is, in fact, the case in Brazil. You have that provision in the constitution, and that, and so any kind of quota law that imposes some restriction can be seen as in tension with that principle. If you think of democratic structures, then you have, the understanding, at least, in old constitutional democracies, that a general representation system, one person, one vote, no distinction, was just fine, right? It was just a defined democracy. So there is that tension always. Having said that, I would draw constitutionally, I would draw a big line with Brazil falling here and Argentina falling here probably, pretty much around that time, in terms of a moment at which constitutions start incorporating, and Argentina was a pioneer, some provisions that explicitly allow for these kinds of measures, versus others like the Brazilian case or the Spanish case of constitutions that were drafted before under a different human rights setting with less participatory processes, although the Brazilian already had the lobby du botton. It did have a feminist input, but of course the standards at the time were the standards at the time. And I think, parity was not so much in the horizon. So you can really draw a line between, neo-constitutionalism, post-Beijing, 90s onwards, where some of these provisions are very much present. And there's a very interesting evolution with the more recent constitutions in the Andean region. I'm thinking of Bolivia or Ecuador, or now the recent reforms in Mexico, where not only do we have provisions that allow for gender quotas in electoral domain, but they expand to the judiciary or the executive. So in those contexts, of course, you can expect contestation to be less strong constitutionally speaking. And in fact, if you looked at what has happened in some European countries like France or Italy, but also Portugal, Slovenia, or Belgium, you needed a constitutional amendment to make quotas stand, constitutionally. In some cases, these constitutional amendments proceeded preemptively, in fear that they would be struck down. In others, it was actually required because the Conseil Constitutionnel in France, or the Swiss Federal Constitutional Court, or the Italian Constitutional Court had struck down quotas, so you actually needed to pass constitutional amendments. And you do have a wave of constitutional amendments that enabled quotas. That, I think, is different. And that contestation, let me say, unfortunately, has not subsided. So currently, we have the German case. In Germany, just last year, the two Länder legislation, Thüringen and Brandenburg, the constitutional courts of this Länder struck down zipper list quotas on the basis that they contravened the usual suspects: political party autonomy, formal equality. Bad news, and linked to the previous talk, Alternative für Deutschland, so the extreme right wing, is behind the contestation of the gender quotas. And so it remains to be seen what the federal constitutional court would say, where a similar law be passed by a federal, Congress, Bundesrat, which hasn't happened yet, but it remains an open question, right? I think, in new constitutionalism, where I think quotas per se are not contested in terms of prima facie, but I think Paula was very clearly referring to cycles of judicialization. And in Latin America, both Supreme Court, constitutional courts, and electoral tribunals have been very active, not just in Brazil, but also in Mexico, as you know. And there, of course, the question is, proportionality, right? Because even if you say, prima facie, these quotas are legitimate because, you still have lots of room for interpretation about, should these be seen as temporary measures, as permanent measures? Are we talking about thresholds? Are we talking about parity? And more importantly, how do we make sure that, they're not fooled around, through all the schemes that you mentioned and many more the political parties have been able to create to preserve the male hegemony in politics. And so different courts have been more or less willing, I would say Latin America often rather willing, to actually, guide in terms of setting standards for good practice to make sure that, these legislative schemes are not simply, fooled. But I think you're right to say that it raises legitimacy questions about, is this really the proper role of courts, or should, political bodies be doing this when it comes to, really creative interpretations of legal standards that basically have voids and have, gaps to fill out. But in the end, you can always make the case, especially because in no country, I think there's a couple of decisions where I doubt, where I have my doubts, but in most, in almost all countries, you haven't had the recognition of a right, of a subjective rights entitlement by women to ask for these kinds of measures. So it's always the legislature that takes these measures. And then the question is, are those proportional measures, or do they, go too far in undermining other domains of constitutional freedom, other constitutional rights? So I think it is unlikely that you're going to see, constitutional contestation subsided, though the nature of that contestation probably varies depending on whether your constitution has been drafted more recently and already contains an enabling clause, or whether it is totally gender neutral and silent about this, in which case, it is probably, you have more grounds, as you see in Germany. I would have expected that Germany by now, there was kinds of a European consensus that democracy means parity democracy, and that of course quotas should be okay. There's a whole soft law by the Council of Europe, endorsing gender balance, compensation, and representation. And in spite of that, you see the hardcore, constitutional doctrine, haunting back and saying, well, actually, in good old constitutional law, these measures are in tension with foundational principles of our democratic system. So we'll see what happens next. But constitutional contestation of one kind or another, I think, is likely to remain in the scene. And then we're back to Malcolm's point about opportunity structures and which courts offer what opportunities for what political forces to mobilize.
Thank you. I would like to, well, I myself have a lot of questions and potential comments, but I would first like to see if anyone from the audience, either here or online, someone might have to help me with the online comments. If anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment.
We have a comment online. She's online, she will ask you.
Okay.
I have a question for Francesca, if no one does.
Yeah.
Just keep me in the line.
Yeah.
There's a comment from one of the PhD students.
Great. So do you think she can make the comment herself directly? And if the person who wants to make the comment could just say to whom, or if for the whole panel or for one person in particular, so that we can... Is it Isha?
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
Hello.
we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So it's just an observation on what Francisca was mentioning about Indian situation and the quotas out here. So now we have studies that have been conducted across the country, which talk about the quotas losing their relevance, specifically when it comes to educational institutions. So we had quota at one point of time just to get away with the idea of exclusion, but now after 75 years, they are not actually solving any further purposes. So there's adequate representation from that particular community, like I'm talking about a community called as OBC, that we call as other backward classes in India. So they have been adequately represented in admissions, like educational institutions, and also in jobs, and also in promotions. So we have studies, data analytical studies across various fields, which actually suggest that that kind of quota right now is not making any sense any longer. So that's just an observation, but I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you so much.
I think, I don't know if Francesca would like to comment, but I know Ruth.
My question is
Yeah.
also to Francisca. And Francesca, I know that for a long time, well, firstly, I found interesting that although the Indian constitution was actually, it does have a certain paternalistic tone in it, but it came with relevant gender provisions that were rather advanced for its time. We're talking 1951. So two quick questions. One is, what explains the fact that the gender quotas didn't make it really to the initial text, although they had, like the other quotas, been part of the measures that had already been taken? And then I know that for a long time there was a proposal of a proposed constitutional amendment to include gender quotas beyond the panchayats at the national level, but it never really passed. If you could just say a few words about the politics behind that.
Catarina, do you want me to answer?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first on the point on the OBC reservations, so thank you so much, Isha. In some sense, I think it's the best outcome you can have if the quota is considered no longer needed, right? Quota is that kind of policy that if it can render itself obsolete, that's sort of great success. The interesting thing about institutional dynamics is that once you have an institution in place, it's really hard to get rid of them again, because you get vested interests and habits, and it's really hard to remove institutions, even if they're meant to become unnecessary. To sort of answer your comment in a somewhat more general way, though. The OBC quotas, I think the other backward classes, which is this huge category that originally was considered half of the Indian population, but for legal reasons, it was reduced to about 24% of the population, because otherwise you got quotas that were too large. That category is a political category. It has no natural cultural, regional origin. And there's no serious systematic discrimination against people from that category. So when one goes through a lot of work on quota politics, I think a lot of people come to agree that quotas are a really useful measure if, no matter how wealthy, educated, brilliant people become, they still have no chance of getting into somewhere. But that's really not the case for OBCs. And so OBCs are those kind of categories that, for reasons of poverty and lower education, etc., I can understand why people wanted to include that category. But it's really the inequality of characteristics, background characteristic, that was the problem, not some inherent sense of exclusion of that category. Well, if you think of scheduled castes, the former untouchables, no matter how successful they become, a lot of people still harbor feelings of inferiority towards them. And I think also in many countries, however brilliant women are, there might be a systematic exclusion because of bias. And so it's important to think about why exclusion takes place, whether it's because of some inherent bias or because of inequality in people's access to resources, for example. But thanks so much for that comment. On the Indian Constitution and the Women's Bill, it's a really interesting discussion of that, actually, because since 1996, there's been a discussion of getting women's quotas in state assemblies and parliament for women in India. There was very little resistance of getting quotas in the panchayats, in the lower levels of politics. And so I think most people who look at arguments about this, they just say, well, the people who voted on it, the people who vote in parliament on whether you should have village reservations, quotas, don't lose anything from doing that. Well, if they vote on getting quotas in parliament and state assemblies, they're risking losing their own seat. And their parties and their colleagues get affected in a different way. And so at least the articles I've seen on this have argued that it's really about self-preservation of mostly male legislators in the parliament who don't want to lose their own seats. And the sort of the political debate that has stalled the process of the Women's Bill in India has been discussions of exactly like Catarina was talking about the conservatives being elected, that they're saying if we put in place a women's bill, it's going to be upper caste, rich women who get in. As it is, it's the majority of women in parliament in India are dynastic in the sense that they're related to male politicians. And so there's a concern that a quota would just bring in these elite women into politics. We should have sub-quotas. And so people have argued that. So the political reasons for it not passing is that parties can't agree on how the sub-quotas should be organized. The story that most people who write on this think is actually going on is male preservation of power.
Thank you, Francesca. Do we have any other questions? No? So I would like to perhaps ask or perhaps just give a few pointers. Connecting what Paula and Ruth said and about exploring opportunities, or at least how I'm trying to think of how we can explore opportunities in face of backlash and in face of processes that seem similar to what Ruth described in her keynote and what we've been seeing in some of our countries, including Brazil, in terms of the doors being closed to the discussion. I was wondering if Paula could expand a little bit on the discussion or the framing of how framing the term parity happened in Argentina, because when I was listening to Paula and I was listening to Ruth's comment, it reminded me of Martha and how she described the way we discuss abortion in Brazil and how we've been avoiding the most loaded concepts, right? So we've been avoiding the difficult conceptual discussions about abortion, about choice, and we've been doing this through like a discussion of health. And in the case of Brazilian gender quota, parity never really, I mean, of course, there are sectors of the women's movement that are trying to bring the discussion of parity, but it seems like we're always discussing quotas without really discussing parity, right? So we're always avoiding facing the discussion and because we are facing losing the little that we have, and this is or I don't know, I'm just speculating really. So if Paula could, if you have anything to contribute and in a way help us Brazilians think about this, and I think Ruth also pointed to that. And about financing, I was thinking again, I'm thinking about opportunities or doors being closed in many countries and in my own, right? And the discussion being of putting what we have in jeopardy. And so I was thinking, you mentioned briefly bottom-up initiatives and also other you found in your research and in the scholarship there is about this topic, positive effects without quotas. So if you could perhaps just comment a little bit more so we can perhaps speculate. And I think because of the PhD candidates also, I think it would be interesting to try to understand a little bit more the cases where we can study or start finding ideas once doors in formal arenas close. How do we do bottom-up initiatives that can help to include women, and in particular in the issue of money, which is paramount when you're running, right?
So I can say an answer because this is a new research agenda for me, so I don't have enough study of the background of these conversations to give you really a more assertive reply. But one very important aspect of the history of quotas in Argentina is that they have been a top-down initiative, not a women's movement demand. And this is a very important thing, because I think that that's a huge debt of the agenda of the Argentine women movement, the discussion of women and power and the strategies to access power. So we have been very successful in taking the streets and in organizing national encounters of women for 30 years now, but we haven't been really able to discuss access to power and elite power in particular. This is probably like the style of the Argentine egalitarian and more collectivist tradition that is, it has really avoided, in terms of its progressive movements, if they have avoided a deeper conversation about access to elitist power. So the quotas were a project of an elite group of women in the late 80s and early 90s. And they were also the result of women in politics asking for more after the Ni Una Menos movement, but they were not a demand of the women's movement. So this is, I think, important in terms of how much we have follow up the enforcement, how much we have been really organized from a bottom-up perspective to request for instance, access to resources, and for us also to sustain the women in power. Like really, this is also very important. The ties between the women's movement and some women in power are connected to the human rights movement, and special areas like in health or other places where we have been working. But in terms of access to politics, there is really a lot of tension between powerful women and the women's movement and the feminist agenda. Actually, the first female president that ran the country for 8 years didn't touch the abortion conversation, and actually she opposed it. So that's just an example to give you. Also, the fact that this is the 3-decade year for the celebration of the quota law, and there haven't been any event on it, it reflects on how it's not on the cultural and political agenda. So with that caveat, I would say that the framing has been the framing that the politicians in the small group of members, like of a new generation of women of different parties that formed a coalition that moved in the last day, in the last hour of the last night of a parliamentary year, the process of adopting the law has taken to the floor. But this was not actually like a really strong framing embraced by the women's movement across Argentina or the country. And the very basic framing was more women in power is more justice and more equality. There was not really much more. And I refer to Quito and the democratic parity because that's what scholars have been using to frame the process. And some of the speeches in the support of the law were arguing in those terms, but really it was not much debated. And the whole history of the passage of the law and how it was like taken by surprise in the last night in which it was going to lose parliamentary standing tells you something about the low degree of conversation and framing and deliberation behind it.
Yeah, the bottom-up initiatives. So we've seen a lot of, in different countries around the world, there's been this understanding that it's really, really expensive to stand for an elected office, to stand for election. And you have to travel around, you have to go and visit your different sites, go at rallies, give gifts, have posters. You also sometimes have to pay to get on air, to have your telephone covers. So it's a lot of things that is actually very expensive with standing for election. So then either different political parties, it's also international donors, but also the non-governmental organizations have started to have this. So if we see this inequality, we see that very few women lack motivation to actually stand for election because it's so expensive. So how can you actually do this? Like, how can you actually go there and participate? So there is this, so what if, so the idea was, it started with the analyst list. It's the most important, most famous one, and a list in the United States. Kind of early money is like GIST, it's called, that if you give women early money in the early campaigns while they are trying to get nominated in the political parties to be picked to stand to be the candidate of a political party, that's actually crucial, because that's the stage where you actually you have to even fund your campaigns more, because later you can be funded by a political party, but at that stage you often have to go with your own funding and also your local networks. So the idea was to give fund directly to women who wanted to stand, to make them more equipped to do so. And so the interesting thing with the Emily list, how it started, was that was a political, it was for women who wanted to stood on a pro-abortion agenda. But you have had the same idea in different countries where you don't have such a policy, that they need to be connected to a certain type of policy, like these later initiatives in the United States, which is more open, but sometimes it does really have depend on who you are. But we can also see initiatives in Malawi that's been going on since 2009, where the international donors, including the Norwegian embassy, has given money into these kind of pocket funds, where they give women funding to women who want to stand for election. In the beginning, it was to candidates and actually giving financial means like money, cash handouts. But later they had this idea that it got really controversial and also very difficult to monitor. So instead of doing that, they started to pay the registration fee for women. And you can also see in other countries, like in Ghana, they have this, that in the political parties, they have women who want to compete in the candidate selection process. They just have to pay half of the men, of what men need to pay. So there are these different mechanisms that are adopted across the world, and which is kind of popping up often because there is no quota, and also because you see that it is so expensive to stand for election. A lot of these initiatives hasn't really been, they are difficult, and I think they are more difficult than quotas, because you can't really, they have these initiatives and they have a certain goal. Like in Malawi, there is the 50-50 initiative. The idea is that the goal is parity. But the success story is when it went up from about 14% women in the National Assembly up into 22% women, so that was really an achievement by having this extra focus on women. So it's kind of possible to do these things, although it's kind of difficult to see the impact, and it might change, but kind of it might change from year to year. Sometimes it's difficult to get funding. Sometimes we've seen that candidates are coming up, they're getting money to run for an election, but either they kind of didn't really want to stand for election, they wanted more fame. Other times they're giving funding to women who are not really liked by their political parties. So they're never actually going to have a chance of getting anywhere. But still, it's kind of the idea that it's possible to do something else that have been driving these initiatives. So we can actually see that some places in the world, it does make a difference, and probably mostly also in the motivation of women to standing, that is kind of this positive, you get something. It's not enough, but you get something. And also that the problem of funding is addressed somehow, seem to have an effect on women's who want to stand. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So this would be about Brazil, because although I think, Paula, you're right that, it wasn't, after all, no matter how many women make it to powerful position, you're still talking about a few people. So it's difficult to see that women and grassroots women would hugely mobilize for something that is going to really translate into a few more people making it to the privileged club. But still, I think if you look at the region, you do see a certain pattern, and I'm talking about Latin America, of, first threshold quotas, those then raising to parity aspirations, constitutional provisions, first rather timid, like the Argentinian one, but more and more, assertive. So there is, regional standards and normative aspirations, like the Quito framework. So the question is, and I understand, the women in Brazil saying in the current Bolsonaro time, better retain what we have than risk losing it. But is there a narrative about Brazilian exceptionalism? Because in a way, this goes against all the literature around, regional isomorphism and contagion and everything. So is there some kind of rhetoric about, we don't need, because you would need, from the outside, it's like, what don't you need to justify this outlier position in a region where, globally speaking, probably sets the standards now? So it's something of a regional pride, so to speak. Do you feel that there's any need of saying, of explaining Brazilian exceptionalism?
You mean on part of who opposes?
On the part of who opposes it.
That's a good question. I don't think so. It's something for us who are promoting quotas and trying to expand, because when I don't want to downplay the major role that the feminist movement, and particularly the Black feminist movement in Brazil, has been occupying in terms of asking for parity and lobbying for parity. So there is a huge pushback, and backed by leftist parties in Congress. So there is a social movement behind that, asking for parity. Interestingly enough, and I think my initial, although I haven't reflected on this carefully, so I'm a little bit afraid of saying something too peremptory about it, I would say no, which maybe shows the abyss between what is being discussed in Congress on what political leadership and the political elite that is there, the kind of confrontation that they face, versus what we as scholars and activists are requesting, and how we see this bubbling up in the women's social movement in Brazil. So my initial reaction to your provocation would be, I don't think they are even worried about that. One interesting thing, or maybe one thing that may have puzzled some people that are looking at the electoral reform and being like, well, one of the person who was leading the electoral reform in the lower house is a woman. And people are like, wow, she's a woman who is not trying to expand gender quotas. She's saying she is, but she's not actually. In order to understand that, we've been, the experts and the political scientists say, wow, you have to see these women as incumbents, right? So the political elite, once you become a part of the game and you're there, you don't necessarily have a commitment. And as I said, some of the women that got elected in the last national elections are conservative women, aligned with Bolsonaro and aligned with other center-right parties. So they don't have necessarily a platform to promote parity. They don't have a firm commitment. They have a rhetoric that they are saying that they are promoting women, but not necessarily. And this has been a big kind of charade, right? In the public debate, they say, they come forth and they say, oh, we're going to champion women, we're going to set the gender quota at 15%. And then all of us experts and everybody in the social movement saying, but we already have 15%, this is no gain. But my initial reaction would be, I don't think how the debate is being shaped at the moment, they don't feel constrained. They don't feel the need to explain this exceptionalism, or they haven't been, they don't have to account for it, because I don't think this has reached the larger debate, public debate. I don't think there is a huge, we're trying as scholars and as social movement and women's movement, we're trying to bring this to the table, but I don't think at the moment this has a huge, although focal groups and research with focal groups of electors show that in the population, the data shows that there is a huge acceptance of gender quotas, and usually the voters think that parties should promote women. So it shows the divide, how this being led in Congress, turning their back not only to the social movements that back parity, but also to the voters' wishes, that is to at least see more women on the lists. So, but I don't think so far they have been constrained by and feeling very embarrassed about this narrative of exceptionalism. I think usually it's like, wow, formal equality, where we've seen women saying that as well. We're excluding men, potentially excluding men, we're treating men differently, and that's illegal, or it's a matter of formal equality. We shouldn't have any provisions or things like that. So this is as far as they go in terms of justifying their position.
Very, very interesting, because in so many countries, and like other issues like abortion or reproductive rights, women have been able to coalesce around parity because it's a procedural thing. All women want more power regardless of what the policies they will then push for. So it is a relatively easy thing to coalesce around, if there's anything, right? Because it doesn't get you into the substance of the policies that you're going to then push. And I wonder whether, if you draw parallels with the reproductive rights debate, whether in those debates Brazil compares itself regionally, or does Brazil simply think that there's no other country in the region worth looking at?
Yeah.
Kind of the American exceptionalism story.
It's interesting listening to you. For me, it's clear, and I think some of us recognize that this tendency to exceptionalism, but I don't think this has reached the debate, and I don't think that this creates any impediment on that front, on the other side of the front, to proceed as they are, so I don't think this was put in these terms. Maybe we should, right? Because this is a way of saying, look to our neighbors, but then they would say, oh, but they're left wing. If you look at Bolivia, or if you look at other countries, then the rhetoric comes up again, the conservative rhetoric will come up again, and it's just self-explanatory, right? It's like, wow, exactly, they are exactly what we don't want to become, and it helps fuel their base, their electoral base. But I think one thing we have to look at, and I think it's a topic that doesn't have that much scholarship, is conservative women. So I think this is an important topic, because this also, to some extent, explains why we have the status quo that is sitting so nicely. And if you look at the bills both in the Senate and in the lower house, they're both like, they don't look good in terms of like our gender quota. What they are proposing is not really a huge substantial improvement, and they are backed by women. So some women, let's say. So this is definitely something to some extent of a paradox. So I think we reached the limit of our panel. I would like to thank our panelists, Francesca and Paolo, also, were joining us online, and everybody that joined us here and online. Thank you so much. I hope we can continue this discussion.